U.S. President Barack Obama is on a three-nation tour of Africa. This time around, though, it is unlikely his visit will kick up the kind of euphoria it did when he first came calling soon after his historic election as the U.S. first ever African-American president. Instead, his visit provides an opportunity for a full audit of U.S. policy in Africa under the Obama administration. The key questions are, is the United States losing ground in Africa? And is someone else perhaps now setting the agenda for U.S. engagement in Africa? Well, joining us from Washington, D.C. to shed some light on the circumstances of the Obama visit and its probable objectives is Dr. David Shinn, an adjunct professor of international affairs at the George Washington University. Dr. Shinn previously served as the U.S. ambassador in Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. From Johannesburg is Mr. Prince Mashele, the executive director at the Center for Politics and Research. And joining us a little later on in the program from Beijing is Victor Zhikai Gao, a director at the China National Association of International Studies. But first, an analysis of the possible economic and political objectives of President Obama's visit to Africa.
Barack Obama has launched a three-nation tour of Africa. It is the first time the U.S. president is visiting Africa since his re-election last November. In the first term of his presidency, Obama visited Ghana and Egypt. In the eyes of the U.S., Ghana is a beacon of democracy for Africa, while Egypt remains strategic for U.S. interests in the volatile Middle East. This time round, President Obama's whirlwind tour of Africa takes him to Senegal, South Africa and Tanzania.
The year after Senegal achieved independence, President Senghor came to the White House and met with President Kennedy. And during his visit to the United States, President Senghor said, "Senegal is a small country, but it is a republic which is inspired by the principles of democracy."
Again, like during his first tour of the continent, certain considerations, presumably economic and political, may have influenced the choice of the three nations. But the context within which Obama returns to Africa isn't quite the same. The ground has shifted quite radically. The U.S. has continued to be relegated in terms of who Africa is now engaging with more in trade and on development. New players led by China are emerging. The figures speak volumes.
Applauding and encouraging, supporting democratic institutions, doing more to highlight the importance of trade and investment in economic growth, and putting a special emphasis not on the past, but on Africa's future.
Indeed, for those keenly watching events in Africa, it's no surprise that two of the three countries on the itinerary of Obama's Africa tour were visited by Chinese leader Xi Jinping in March. President Xi visited Tanzania, South Africa and Congo-Brazzaville. Business people and investors reinforce his suggestions that the U.S. is wary of losing further ground to players like China, Brazil, India and Turkey. But can Obama, who some now rate poorly behind his predecessors Bill Clinton and George Bush, with regard to his performance in Africa, reverse the rising tide?
Beyond the historic significance of a son of Africa being in the White House, there has not been much substantive change. So what you have seen is an intensification of the U.S. military presence in Africa, particularly in resource-rich areas. And what you have seen is an overly intensified focus on security, a very narrow definition of security, this quest for terrorists, wherever they may lie, often at the expense of human security, of human needs and human development on the continent.
Years down the line, the euphoria that his historic election in 2008 kicked up in Africa has died down, and that deep sense of expectation and anticipation is gradually being replaced by one of skepticism, even cynicism.
All right, so what are the possible objectives of President Obama's visit to Africa? First, Dr. Shinn in Washington, D.C. Now, Obama is making a rather extended visit to Africa after a rather long lull there. What will be the objective? What is the intended objective of this visit?
I think there are essentially three objectives to the visit. One is to show support for African economic development and U.S. assistance to support that development. in terms of programs like the Millennium Challenge Account and the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. A second objective is to show support for those African countries that are doing particularly well in the democratization process, and hence the President has picked 3 countries that have strong records on good governance and democratization. And the third objective is to try to energize the American private sector to engage more vigorously in Africa in terms of investment particularly, but also in terms of trade. And I think those are the 3 major objectives of the visit.
All right. Prince Mashele, there in Johannesburg, though, there are 3 objectives there of the visit, showing support for Africa's development objectives. But Africans have been wondering, though, where has President Obama been? What is the perception here in Africa?
Well, the perception here in Africa is that this is a trip a little too late. When President Obama was elected first time around as the President of the United States, there was a lot of goodwill and excitement on the African continent that the U.S. would have some kind of a special focus on Africa. So there is a sense in Africa that he has not quite focused on the continent as the people of the continent had expected him to do so, given the fact that he's an African American.
We have been talking to Africans across the continent on what they feel or what they think about President Obama's visit to the continent. Let's listen in.
In Tanzania, we have the culture of welcoming whoever comes. So that is only what I can offer. Out of it, I don't have any hope with the Obama visit.
I'm feeling very happy because, as I have said it before, there are about 54 African countries, and then he has decided to visit Tanzania. This is a great honor to us.
We Senegalese, we are expecting much from the Americans in terms of economics, in terms of energy security. There is some American companies which are investing in the energy sector in Senegal.
Of course, I do care because it's very sad. This president is a son of this country. We feel he belongs here. It's very sad that he's not coming this side.
It hasn't been, though, a red carpet welcome, so to speak. There's talk of some protests in South Africa. Some African business people have declined invitations to meet him in Tanzania or Senegal. Why the change of heart now from Africa towards President Obama?
Look, I think he made a mistake. The first impression lasts. If I were him, I would have visited Africa during his first term. The fact that he did not visit Africa during his first term sent out a negative message to the people of Africa that, unlike what they had thought he would do, he does not take Africa seriously. I'm not surprised that the welcome is rather lukewarm, given the fact that people waited for the whole first term and he did not come to Africa.
All right, Dr. Shinn, has President Obama there made a mistake in his first term when it comes to Africa?
Well, I think it's fair to say that expectations were very high that he would spend more time dealing with Africa than was the case. He did, of course, visit Ghana, and he also visited Egypt. That was in connection primarily with Middle Eastern issues. But there was an expectation that he would involve himself more in African affairs. The problem is he got caught up in some very serious financial issues in the United States that pretty much consumed much of his first administration. Not to mention winding down wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and other international problems. So expectations were high, and he clearly did not meet them.
All right, expectations were high, though, but China is now the dominant player when it comes to trade in Africa. Would you say, though, that the United States has missed out?
I think if you look at the trade and the investment issues, they're driven primarily by the American private sector. And if the private sector is not thoroughly engaging in those areas, then you're not going to have much increase. There's not a great deal the government can do to encourage investment and trade. They can do some things, and there are some government programs that try to encourage that, but they're really quite limited programs. And unfortunately, the American private sector has also drawn back somewhat from Africa in the last decade or so.
All right, Prince Mashele, let me put that to you, though. When it comes to establishing trade and investment partnerships, has the United States, though, perhaps missed out in Africa?
I think the United States has certainly missed out. I think that they have underestimated the influence of other players on the African continent, particularly China. I mean, if you take the South African situation, for example, before 2009, the U.S. was the largest trading partner of South Africa. And since then, the picture has changed. Today, China is the largest trading partner with South Africa. And it's very clear that strategically, the relations between South Africa and China, it's actually blossoming. I doubt if these trends are going to be reversed, because if you look at trade data, it's very clear that the relations between Africa and China are actually growing. So I think that the U.S. has missed out, and I think that the visit by President Obama to Africa is part of an attempt to reverse that trend. As to whether that will be possible, only time will tell.
All right. President Obama did speak about governance, good governance being a dominant theme of U.S. policy in Africa when he was in Ghana in 2009. Well, let's just listen in.
Development depends on good governance. That is the ingredient which has been missing in far too many places for far too long. That's the change that can unlock Africa's potential. And that is a responsibility that can only be met by Africans.
All right. In 2009, during his visit to Ghana, President Obama spoke about governance being a pinnacle of U.S. foreign policy in Africa. Now, China's economic policy has been dominant on the continent. Now, first, Dr. Shinn, the question of U.S. foreign policy being pegged on good governance, is that going to change, though, now that China, for instance, India and Turkey are playing on an economic platform in Africa?
Well, you're quite right to point out that when you talk about important players, important countries in Africa today, it's clearly not just the United States and China. India, Brazil, Turkey, Japan, South Korea, obviously continuing with the European countries. They all are important players. They all have an impact. Their interests vary to some extent, and there, in some cases, is collaboration, and in some cases, competition, particularly at the commercial level, where the United States competes with all of those countries. But in the area of governance, I think there can be a lot of collaboration in terms of encouraging improved governance on the continent, and I think even most Africans are calling for that.
Is that going to remain a dominant pinnacle of U.S. policy on the continent?
Well, it certainly is going to be one of the priorities of U.S. policy. And having said that, I would be the first to admit that there is not always a total consistency in terms of how the United States applies that policy, because you have to take into account your security interests in particular countries and weigh that against the role of democratization in a particular country. So there will appear, and indeed there are, some inconsistencies in terms of how the U.S. applies this.
All right. Prince Mashele, just give us an insight. How would you compare, though, U.S. policy in Africa vis-a-vis the policy of Africa with emerging partners like China, like India, like Turkey?
Well, it seems to me that the Chinese have decided to focus more on investment, and they shy away from the policy of dishing out instructions as to what African countries should do with regard to their own politics. And I think that's where the Americans should learn a lesson from the Chinese. Africans don't want to be instructed and be told what they must do in terms of governing their own country. The policy of governance is a progressive policy. But when it comes in the form of an instruction from a country that is perceived historically to be a superpower such as the US, that tends to make Africans think that they are being instructed to act in a particular way. So the difference is that China is hesitant, it's very hesitant to tell Africans as to what to do. But the US is bolder in terms of pronouncing on matters political. That, I think, are fundamental differences. But then Africans compare the two countries, for example, and say, what do we get from the Americans and what do we get from the Chinese? If they get development and investment from the Chinese, my sense is they would be more inclined to go with the Chinese than the Americans.
All right. Dr. Shinn, do you agree?
Well, not entirely. I think I would use certainly a different choice of words. The United States does not and cannot instruct any African country what to do. The African leadership ultimately makes its own decisions. The United States does have, in the case of some countries, a policy where it will withhold or increase assistance depending upon the policies of that country, but it can't instruct a country what to do. That's ultimately the decision of the country itself. So I think that's a very important distinction. It is true that China does not follow that kind of a policy. They have a policy of no strings attached to their aid. Now, you can argue that that certainly is a more popular policy with African governments. I know of no African government that wants to be encouraged to do something it doesn't want to do. But there are civil society groups in Africa that are very supportive of this practice. So you have to weigh the two groups.
All right. Dr. Shinn and Prince Mashele, well, let's just listen in on what President Xi Jinping of China said when he was in Tanzania during his African visit early this year.
China and Africa have always been a community of shared destinies and similar historic experiences. Common development tasks as well as shared strategic interests have bound the two sides together. China and Africa regards each other as development opportunities.
All right, Prince Mashele in Johannesburg. Now, President Obama is visiting two of the three countries that President Xi Jinping visited in March of this year, Tanzania and South Africa. Now, would you say, though, or how are we reading this? First, why the three countries, or why the two countries? And is China sort of now setting the agenda, or setting the agenda for the U.S. on the continent?
Quite clearly, President Obama is trying to neutralize the influence of China in Africa. The fact that he is visiting countries that were also visited by the Chinese leader suggests to me that he is trying to erase the footsteps of the Chinese. The fact that he is coming after the Chinese visited Africa, to me suggests that whether the Americans like it or not, China, when it comes to Africa, is beginning to play a strategic leadership role. And the fact that the Chinese emphasize development and investment, I think that places them in a better situation compared to the Americans.
All right, Dr. Shinn, quite briefly though, why the three countries? What informed the three countries that President Obama will be visiting: Senegal, South Africa and Tanzania?
Yes, I don't think that the decision by President Obama to visit those three countries has anything to do with the fact that the Chinese president visited two out of the three. Whenever an American president makes a decision to go to, say, in this case, three countries on the continent, you first look for geographical distribution. In this case, they chose West Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa. I don't know how the Chinese do it. In the case of Xi Jinping, the choice was East Africa, Southern Africa, and Central Africa with Congo-Brazzaville. But that's just a fact of life, to have the geographical distribution. You then look in those different regions for countries that you are particularly comfortable with, both in terms of governance and in terms of the economic development relationship. And Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania fit the bill in every case. There are countries that are simply considered naturals for an American president to visit. There are other choices you could have made. You could have gone to Botswana in southern Africa, but South Africa is simply a more important country.
All right, Dr. David Shinn, an adjunct professor of international affairs at George Washington University, and Prince Mashele, the executive director, Center for Politics and Research in Johannesburg. We will return to this discussion in a moment. Don't go away.
There is a village in West Africa where man and beast live side by side in perfect harmony. Prosper Kabore is no ordinary man. He is the keeper of the sacred crocodiles of Bazule, and it is up to him to make sure the legend continues.
Crocodile can be really dangerous.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. We have been talking about President Obama's Africa visit this week. We are joined from Johannesburg by Prince Mashele, the Executive Director, Center for Politics and Research. And joining us now from Beijing is Victor Zhikai Gao, a Director at the China National Association of International Studies, joining us from Beijing. Well, so how has Obama performed in Africa compared to his predecessors, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush? And how will Africa judge him at the end of his second and last tenure as U.S. President? First, Mr. Mashele in Johannesburg, how will Africa judge the U.S. President Barack Obama after his tenure?
I think it's going to be a harsh judgment. The excitement that was generated by the fact that he's an African American, I think, has disappeared. He did not make use of his first term to actually deliver on concrete expectations that the Africans have had in the area of development, in the area of trade. The fact that in most African countries, the U.S. was overtaken by China under Obama's presidency, in my view, does not actually sell President Obama well. And I think that that has generated disappointment on the part of Africans and on the part of many observers who had thought that President Obama would place a particular emphasis on the African continent. Well, I am afraid it's not going to be a positive judgment.
Mr. Gao, let me get your take on President Obama's visit to Africa, coming so shortly, of course, after President Xi Jinping was on the continent in March. What's your take?
Well, personally, I wish President Obama all the good luck, and I give him all the best wishes for his African visit. And I only wish that he could have spent more time in Africa. Africa, after all, is a big continent, 3 times the size of China, or 3 times the size of the United States, and with 1 billion people, 54 countries throughout Africa. It takes time, and it takes a lot of patience and goodwill and commitment and devotion for any country to be really constructively engaged in Africa. So I think President Obama has his strength. He's the first African-American president, and I hope he can really do constructive things on behalf of the United States in Africa. Africa is big enough for both China and the United States to be constructively engaged in, I think.
Let's look at that constructive engagement, though, because for many years, U.S. policy on Africa has leveraged on democracy, while China is investing heavily in economic and infrastructural development. How is that Chinese model of engagement in Africa impacting U.S. policy on the continent?
Well, I would say China cares a lot about governance. But the difference between China and the United States, not only in Africa, but also probably in global context, is that whereas America, in many cases, tends to believe that it has the truth, the total truth, nothing but the truth, and is eager to impose its version of the truth on other countries, China is much more modest, and China is much more humble. And we do not think we have the total truth, and we engage with the African countries on equal footing, and we do not want to be lectured by others, and as a result, we do not lecture African countries. And we engage in constructive dialogue with them and treating each other as brothers and sisters on equal footing. I think that's the difference, and I hope this will become more and more appreciated in the years to come.
When you look back, though, at that policy of China, of no political strings attached to its assistance or trade with Africa, why is that very critical for China, though?
Well, I think there is a lot of discussion about this conditionality to foreign assistance or direct investment into Africa. I tend to disagree with this. I think, for example, given the history of colonialism in Africa for hundreds of years, I think all the major economies in the world, including China, the United States, Japan, European countries, Brazil, India, so you name it, I hope the more they can invest in Africa, the better. And in terms of political aspirations, etc., it's completely up to the African countries and the people in Africa to decide what exactly will be the government form and what should be their political aspirations, etc. And people outside of Africa should give the African countries full respect for their political aspirations. We should not lecture the African countries as if we know better than the African countries. And economically speaking, I think that's where the bread and butter is. And I think all countries need to pitch in to invest in Africa, to engage in trade with African countries. And the more foreign direct investment into Africa, the better.
Victor Gao, in Beijing, there are many entrants now into the African market. Africans are talking about intra-Africa trade, trading with the BRICS countries. There is a changing dynamic here on the continent. What do you see as the future of that?
Well, I would say that there are many challenges and opportunities facing not only the African countries, but Africa as a continent. For example, in terms of infrastructure, airports, highways, railways, port facilities, etc., African infrastructure is very fragmented. As a result, intra-African communication and transportation and movements of goods and peoples and services is not very efficient. And no country can single-handedly do all these infrastructure projects by itself. I think international cooperation will be very important, regional cooperation. Africa eventually probably will be better served if they can really integrate their major infrastructure projects together, major transportation lines. They need to connect the capital cities and major cities with aviation, for example. In this regard, I think companies and countries outside of Africa can really help a great deal by participating in a constructive manner, providing aid and also transfer of technologies and helping training African skilled workforce and capacity building. So I think there will be a lot of things that people and countries and companies outside of Africa can do with Africa for mutual benefit.
All right, Mr. Victor Gao, a director of the China National Association of International Studies, joining us there from Beijing. Thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. Also on the program, Dr. David Shinn, Professor of International Affairs at the George Washington University, joining us from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Prince Mashele, Executive Director, Center for Politics and Research, joining us from Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you for being on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye for now.